If you struggle with DID, multiple personalities, or you know someone who does and you want to help, this podcast episode is for you. Well, welcome back to the Faith of the Fathers podcast. I'm your host, Carl Gessler, here with a special guest, Charles Young. Welcome, Charles.
Thank you, Carl. It's great to be back with you. Great to see you again.
It's been a while.
It has. Too long.
Yes. Charles actually was on a podcast a couple years back.
Right.
Where the first one that I ever did on satanic ritual abuse, and that one is by far the most listened to podcast that I've ever done. And since that time, we've had a lot of people reaching out, looking for help because they recognize themselves in that podcast.
Yeah.
And so Susie and I did a podcast on healing from DID a couple weeks ago. And this is kind of a next step on that because Susie has been mentored by Charles. And so, Charles, thank you today for bringing your expertise and this really wild and weird topic.
It is. Welcome to my world.
That might be a great place to start just before we dive in. Is just like, how did you get involved in?
Yeah.
And what are we talking about for the newbies out there that don't know what DID is? Maybe you can give us the lowdown.
Yeah, and by the way, I watched the video that the podcast that you and Susie did, and thought it was you guys did a great job on
Thank
that,
you.
and a great introduction to this world, and Susie describing her story, I just thought was an excellent introduction for so many to this vital area, and I basically, got involved with emotional healing, 20 years ago at this point. I first learned from a man named Dr. Ed Smith. He has a ministry called Theophostic, which really his ministry, I think, was the sort of the foundation of all of the emotional healing ministries that are around.
Okay.
And he was the one who came up with the idea of there are lies that we all believe, and we ask God to speak truth to the lies that we believe. I mean, that he was the originator of that concept back in the 90s. So about 2000, about a year earlier, I'd gotten involved with deliverance ministry, and then we realized, hey, there's a lot more to this than just casting out demons. So this friend of mine who had taught me about deliverance ministry also taught me about this. And I learned first about replacing lies with the truth. It's like, great, I love this, I can do this. And I really felt called to minister to people emotionally. And then sort of the advanced class was about, the first half of the advanced class was about DID, dissociation. And it made, even though I was not dissociated, it made complete sense to me. And I was amazed at how many of my friends were dissociated and how many wanted ministry for this. And so I got really very comfortable back then doing ministry with dissociation. But then in the second half of the class, his advanced class, he got into ritual abuse. And I had never heard anything like that. I was overwhelmed, grossed out. It just is way too much.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I didn't like the idea of there being somebody out there that I couldn't help.
Right.
And so, I mean, we're called by God to help people, right? And, when you read the Gospels, there was nobody Jesus couldn't help. And he said, the works that I do, you shall do also, right? So I prayed and I said, Lord, if the day ever comes when I can stomach this stuff, I want to be able to help these people. And I forgot about the prayer. And about 10 years later, I had a number of videos in my home that had been gathering dust that were by a woman who is now my mentor and her then husband, who has now passed away, she's a ritual abuse survivor. And so I learned I picked up the videos. The Lord said, get out the videos. We'll watch them. And it was about 25 hours of videos of a long conference that they did. And this was...
This is a lot of 25 hours.
Yeah, yeah. My wife started joking, are you married to me or to those videos? I said, honey, I need to watch these. But that was right before we moved here. And then when we moved here, she we got involved with a church that did a lot of emotional healing right down the road here. And then the pastor said to me one day, "Oh, by the way, this lady's coming to do a workshop." And it turns out this was her. And he said, "A number of people in our church have been invited to go. Do you want to come?" I said, "Yes." And that's when I first met her, and learning her approach to ritual abuse was the beginning of my being willing to take this on. It coincided with my meeting a man who is now a very close friend, who he asked for prayer, asked for ministry. As we started doing prayer and ministry, he discovered he was a ritual abuse survivor. I mean, memories started coming out of nowhere.
Yeah, and that's something I would like to touch on.
To get into,
because that's an important part.
Right.
Yeah.
So basically, I would get into sessions with him, and I was way over my head, and I would email her and say, "What do I do with this?" And she'd email back. Which I was thrilled by because she was a very busy woman. And then I eventually started going through all of her training. Now I've been through all of her training, and in fact, I'll probably be joining up for another sort of postgraduate training session here in a couple months, because she's always learning new things herself.
Right.
So really, and I'll say this, and maybe a lot of guys feel this way, but if I don't have the tools to do something, I get frustrated doing it. But if you give me the tools to do something, then I'm happy to dive in and do it.
Yeah.
And she provided the tools. Now, that may seem strange when it comes to healing, but it's like she helped me to understand this arena. She helped me to understand how to be successful in this arena.
I just want to interject at this point too, that this is one of the benefits that I have had of. It seems wrong to say benefits in regard to this topic, because it's actually about the most profound form of evil that I have ever encountered. I think that ever can be encountered, because the whole satanic ritual thing is about figuring out how to do the most evil.
It is.
And but what it has done is it has completely challenged my comprehension of reality, of what we consider reality. And when we are praying, the Western world has been built on rationalism and the Enlightenment, and that has really kept us in a lot of ways from obeying Jesus's command to cast out demons, to heal the sick, to raise the dead. People just laugh at you. But when you get into this, you realize that the devil knows how the world works a lot better than Christians do. And but in helping people heal, we discover a lot more about the reality of the way heaven and earth, the spiritual realm and the physical realm, interact.
Yeah.
And I think that's beneficial for everybody for doing ministry, just to realize the world is a different place than you think it is.
Right. And perhaps we ought to do a quick distinguishing between DID, dissociation, and ritual abuse.
Yes, please. Yeah.
It's a matter of severity. DID, as you and Susie mentioned in your last podcast, which was great, that DID, dissociative identity disorder, it's recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, and it used to be called multiple personality disorder. You can sort of see why both names have been used. And someone who has been severely abused as a child can be dissociated. And of course, there's degrees of dissociation. Some people you meet have, 2 or 3 alters or parts. Others have dozens. Others have hundreds.
And it would be helpful too, not to derail you, but just to explain what do you mean by dissociate? What does that?
Yes. Well, so I'll get into that in a quick moment. And then ritual abuse survivors are there are people out there who understand dissociation. They understand how to dissociate a small child, and then it becomes part of their satanic rituals. And so it's a much deeper, more methodical,
Sophisticated,
much sophisticated. There are, way more government dollars than should go to this sort of thing. And of course, it's all hidden in black budgets. But there's also, with the ritual abuse survivors, there's a spiritual component where there are evil attachments to the person. And not just demons, but principalities and powers. And you have to be able to remove those first. Then you can get to the dissociation and minister to that. And that's why that's more severe and more complicated. But to your other question about a part or an altar, yes, I think it's good to explain how this happens in the first place. So if you imagine a small child, say under the age of 8, and this can even happen while they're in the womb. The dissociation, there are babies that are born that are already dissociated. And so that small child, does not have a fully developed mind, but they are subjected to what we would call overwhelming trauma. Or another way to describe it is an intolerable conflict. I love my daddy, but my daddy just did something unspeakable to me. It's if you were to liken it to a circuit breaker, it'd be like blowing the circuit breaker of that little child's ability to handle it. And that really, that can be a scenario in which that child could potentially die. It is so bad. In fact, many times when children dissociate, they have been brought to a point of death or a point of they perceive that they're going to die. It is that severe. That's what it takes and basically part of them splits off, takes the pain, and many times takes the memory of what happened. Because if that child were to carry the memory around with them on a day-to-day basis, it would be too much. So, and then, of course, once that child dissociates one time, then every time they are confronted with tough situations, they tend to dissociate more. And when that part splits off, now we'll use the term parts and altars, and in a moment I'd like to explain the difference between the two because it's an important distinction, even though they get used interchangeably. When a part splits off, it is only a part of their brain, so it's got a much more limited capacity to deal with life than a whole person, right? But it deals with a certain sliver of life. When daddy comes into my bedroom in the middle of the night, I know something really bad is about to happen. That part comes forward to deal with what's about to happen. And what happens many times is one part comes forward, but then the next time the overwhelming trauma is too much for that part, so another part has to split off in order to deal with what the first part couldn't deal with. And then the second part, something comes along that's too much for them, so a third part. So many times when a child goes through, after they've been through this for a while, they go through repeated trauma as a child, and it can be, verbal, it can be sexual, it can be violence, physical trauma, whatever the trauma may be. A child can actually go through a whole series of parts. Each one comes out and to deal with a different segment of the trauma that they're being exposed to. And many times they grow up and they're a young adult and they're still around that trauma. Now, an altar versus a part. And there's actually a third term I'd like to introduce, and that's what's called an identity. And a part is a generic term for either an altar or an identity. Now, what happens is if someone is highly dissociated, I mean, they can have dozens or even hundreds of alters. Alters actually live in the back of the brain. I mean, neurologists have done brain scans and actually where they've studied alters. I mean, it's recognized by the APA, right? So they universities have done studies, and alters always, the activity is always in the back of the brain when the alter comes forward. But then when you get a lot of alters, they start to organize into a chain of command, a groupings. I mean, life tends to organize around grouping, right? If you have a business, the business organizes around a chain of command. It just does. And so an identity is like the head over a whole group of alters. There may be dozens of alters. Now, when the neurologists have studied the identities, and when the identity comes forward, the activity, the neural activities in the front of the brain, in the prefrontal cortex, which is very different than the alter, and the identity can live large swaths of life for you. For example, there's one lady that a very dear friend, ritual abuse survivor. I ministered to her for a couple of years. She came to complete wholeness, and now she and I minister together to other people. But she's a teacher, and of grade school students. She had an identity that every time she went to school, she would that identity. She went into teacher mode, and that identity did all of her teaching for her. And then when she would leave the school, she would go home and she would do something else. And she's told me that one day we were doing a session. She said, I had the weirdest thing happen today. And I said, what? And she said, I was teaching in school, and I started thinking about what I need to buy at the grocery store for dinner. She says, I've never done that in my entire life. Because the identity started getting reintegrated. She started thinking more like a whole person who can multitask, especially women, and who can think about what I'm doing right now, as opposed to what I need to do 4 or 5 hours from now.
Interesting.
And so, so as an identity, she's just that identity. Even though it's a large swath of life, it's limited to that swath of life. You can have an identity that is to be around your spouse, who knows how to live life with your spouse. You can have another identity that goes and handles another large section of life. But the big difference is the identity they're up front, they handle large set parts of life. The alter handles a very small sliver of life. Sometimes they're only out for a few seconds. That's all they do. Now, there's something amazing here. We're always looking to reintegrate, right? To bring a part back together.
Make someone whole. Yeah.
Make someone whole. An identity doesn't reintegrate, it merges. Now, when it merges with other identities. And when that identity merges, that whole chain of alters underneath that identity come with it. And they reintegrate as the identity merges. And it is a very powerful form of bringing to wholeness. Because imagine a person who has 500 alters. Are you really going to minister to every single altar? I mean, how long does it take to minister to one altar?
It can take hours.
Hours,
yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
And sometimes 2 or 3 sessions of hours.
Right.
Well, so multiply that times 500. But if you can work with the identities, then in one session you can bring wholeness to dozens of alters. Very powerful.
Yeah. When how do you know? Because one of the things about this is that, and we have prayed with someone who, it was a long session. I experienced a lot of things during that session, and then when
good
we
for
talked,
you, brother.
they didn't. This person didn't remember anything,
right?
Because the part that came forward was like the teacher you were describing. It was in the teacher mode and doesn't ever think about the other things going on.
Well, and let's put a finer pencil point on that one. There's conscious and non-co-conscious. You can have two identities that when one is out, the other is aware of what's going on.
Mm-hmm.
So when the other one comes back, they remember everything when the first one was out. Or you can have non-co-conscious where, identity A comes out, handles something, and then after a while they switch and identity B comes out, and identity B has no memory of what happened with
They must
identity
have
A.
some communication in order for the one to be able to come forward, unless it's just triggers outside the body.
It's a great question. They can be completely walled off from each other. I mean, it's amazing to see. And the only way you got to experience it to believe it.
I mean, you're not saying you need to be dissociated, but you need to watch somebody who is in order
the
to
experience
believe it.
of seeing somebody. I mean, that lady that you experienced, seeing that lady have no recollection of what you had just spent 3 hours with her doing.
Yeah.
I mean, that must have been kind of jaw-dropping.
It is jaw-dropping. There's more to that, too, that when it comes to miracles, which we probably can't get into, but well, I do want to mention this to you.
Sure.
Someone had surgery, and I'm avoiding being too personal here, but someone had surgery where they didn't have certain body parts anymore, like inside them, and yet they had physical manifestations at other times as if they still had that body part.
Wow.
Like, how is that possible? And my only thinking is that the altar that didn't have that surgery was still somehow manifesting that physical. Am I making sense? I don't know if that just sounds like
okay. So the parts are like an organ.
Let's just say like it was
a liver or something.
Yeah.
Was physically removed from the body
Exactly.
in surgery. Like my wife had gallbladder surgery, and her
Right.
gallbladder was removed. Yeah, that part of that could be just the amazing way God has put the body together. That our body is so interconnected that even when part of it is removed, the rest of the body can almost feel that it's still there. It's like you miss its presence.
But it's still, in this case, it still had to physically carry physical matter through the body, and it did it. But without that,
I think I would have to have a pretty deep discussion with
Okay,
you before
okay,
I could attempt
part
to
three.
evaluate that one.
Part three,
part
right
3.
there.
All right. Yeah. We'll see how far we get.
So yeah, just so I would. How does someone go? When the reason I was bringing that up about the different personalities, not knowing, a lot of times, people don't. You don't remember the traumatic things. This is true of even people who haven't dissociated, and well, maybe this is dissociation, but like they know something bad happened, but they don't have any recollection. Like, let's say they went to a Taylor Swift concert, and then they don't remember that they went there.
Right. That's a great example.
Yeah.
So, and I imagine a lot of interesting things go on at a Taylor Swift concert, but that's a separate topic.
So how does someone start to go, I know what's happening?
How do I know if I'm dissociated?
Right.
Yeah, no, it's a great question.
Yeah.
There are a number of telltale signs, and you already mentioned one of them. Anytime you have gaps in memory, that is a real telltale sign. Now, that can be currently, yesterday, or it can be from your childhood. Like one lady that I ministered to who actually you referred to me. She had no memory from the age of 5 to the age of 8.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that told me right there that a lot of really bad stuff happened to her during those 3 years. And as we got into ministry, I could see the effects of what had happened. And I'm not interested in what happened. I'm interested in a person getting healed from what happened. Yeah, and that's the whole
truth
focus.
Is the stuff that actually happens is not stuff anybody wants to hear.
Oh, I to this day I get grossed out hearing some of that stuff. But seeing someone get healed is it just makes my day, makes my week. But so that's one indicator. There's another woman that I know of who in her 40s, all of a sudden these bizarre memories started to come out of nowhere. And, her parents were Nazarene pastors. And the memories were being down in the basement of the church and rich cult ritual, practices or meetings going on down there. And as a small child, she was in there and mommy and daddy were leading them. And these memories came out of nowhere. So that for her, she just about completely collapsed from that. It was overwhelming to hear it. Now, another indicator is the difference between normal memory and traumatic memory. Because the memories many times are bottled up in the parts or the altars, and as you get older, they tend to bleed out, and they suddenly start to come out of nowhere. So if you start getting memories coming out of nowhere, you'll know that some, where did that come from?
Can you tell the difference between a memory and
yes,
a nightmare or an imaginative thought?
It's okay. Great question. Hold that thought for a moment, and I want to get to that, but I want to finish this other thought first because that's a great question too. So you see, normal memory comes through your five senses. It goes to what's called the amygdala in the brain, which assigns a degree of importance to that memory. For example, if I commute to work every day, I take the same, route every day. After a while, I can be lost in thought and get to work and hardly even remember the drive there. That's just, my amygdala is attaching very little significance to those events, right? And then, so the amygdala attaches the event, the importance of the event. Like your birthday, that's an important event. It attaches a lot of importance to that, especially if there's a wonderful celebration. And then the memory is stored in the hippocampus and also in the brain. And normal memory is a little bit like a video. You can almost replay the scene in your mind, right? But when a small child is hit with overwhelming trauma, blow the circuit breaker, what happens is the amygdala gets so overloaded it can't even process the memory, and it can't send it to the hippocampus. So the memory ends up being stored in a part, but it's like a flash, the difference is almost like a photo versus a video, but it's just like a flash of a memory. And it's very disconcerting for these memories to come forward because they're not like normal memory. They're like flashes of memory.
Are they more robust as well?
They're extremely intense. Overwhelmingly intense.
Like you're almost like you're living it over again.
Oh, absolutely, you're living it over again. In fact, you touched upon a very important point there. It will feel, when that memory comes out, it will feel just like what it was like the first time you lived it. It feels like reliving that memory, and which is terrifying. For a survivor. Okay, so I wanted to describe that, but then what was your next question? Oh, about dreams.
How can you tell the difference?
Dreams are extremely spiritual, and sometimes in dreams it's God giving you a dream and He's talking to you. Other times, if the source of if you have a dream and it's not from God, it's bad, like you're being chased by the demonic or something like that in the dream, that dream could very well be a reflection of what is going on in real life, but the dream is being used to reveal to you what is really going on with you spiritually that you just can't see.
Like your spirit communicating to your brain.
Exactly. It's very good way of putting it.
Yeah. So, so if somebody is having these flashbacks of like horrible things they don't know where they came from, they should pay attention.
Well, you have to. You can't run away from it. They're going to happen.
A lot of people do try to, though. With medicine and
yes. It's a very instinctive reaction to just run away from it. These memories are not helping me. I need to function in the real world. I've got a job. I've got a family. I need to. So let's just push this aside and hope that it'll stay aside, and maybe take a couple extra drugs when I go to bed at night, and hopefully all will be well. And that works for a little while, but the trouble is, especially as we get older, it gets harder and harder to push that stuff down and ignore it. Most of the people that I minister to are in their 50s and 60s. Some in their 40s, occasionally younger. I have ministered to people. I've ministered to kids in their teens, although that's unusual. But most people, it's when they get older that not only they can't ignore it anymore. Because, we get older and, the systems that really held together well when we were young start to break down a little bit. And so it's harder to push them aside, and we've got to face them. So if you ignore it, it's not going to ignore you. It's just sooner or later, it's going to come back to where you've got to focus on it and deal with it and get healed.
Another one is pain, isn't it? Like that, just like unexplained levels of pain. I mean, and all this stuff is relevant to me because, like, we've been talking about this for the past year or so, doing deliverance ministry. Jesus said to cast out demons, to heal the sick. I think it's easier to cast out demons than it is to heal the sick.
Yeah.
There's just more
gotta
complications to the healing part.
I totally agree.
Yeah.
Because many times there could be 5 different causes of the symptoms you're seeing in front of you, or 10 different causes, and unless the Lord shows you, you don't know.
Yeah, and it is really being a spiritual doctor in a lot of ways that you're So, but I've prayed with people as well that I'm like, and to this, at this moment, I'm still wondering, okay, there's something more going on with this person. There's stuff about their childhood they don't remember. They wonder if they dissociate, or they do dissociate, but they don't know what that means. Like, where do you go from there?
Well, let's see. Regarding the pain, yes, there is pain can definitely come up in your body in different places, and it can be an altar coming forward and expressing its pain in a way that gets your attention. There's also an excellent book, and I forget the name of the author, but the name of the book is The Body Keeps Score, and it's written by a Harvard professor. Very venerable, and I've got the book in my living room, and I'm about a quarter of the way through it, and some survivors just pick it up and just read the whole thing voraciously. But it is amazing how pain that can appear in your body is not necessarily physical, but rather it can be reflective of past trauma coming back up. For a moment here, a moment there, a day or so here, a day or so there. Yeah, I mean, that's another thing when sicknesses can be a side effect of this. It wears down your immune system to have to deal with all this stuff. And so you get, affected by a lot of stuff as a result. So bringing healing to the parts can also bring a lot of healing and strengthening to your physical body and to your immune system.
Yeah, I imagine too that you said most of the people you minister to are in their 50s and 60s.
Yeah,
that's also like you've gotten married, you've had kids, you've at least a lot of the things that you looked forward to keep you distracted. They've kind of all happened, and now you're starting settling into the last season of life, and things start to catch up to you.
And of course, one of the biggest questions I get is, why couldn't I have received this healing 20 years ago?
Right.
And one thing is we didn't know as much 20 years ago as we know now.
Yeah. And that's, I do want to talk about that for a minute. There's so much more still too, but if you're dissociating, does that mean that you were satanically, you were part of a ritual? Or can you also dissociate just from
abuse? Yes, traumatic abuse. Yes, yes. No, with the trauma that comes from childhood, without the ritual abuse component, yes, there can still definitely be dissociation. My wife gave me permission to talk about in our session my when I got involved with this ministry, 20 years ago, we had been married about 3 years, 2, 3 years at the time. And she was like, okay, well, this is what you want to do, then fine, go do it. And, but she never was really into it herself. And then one day, about 5 years ago, my mentor came to visit and to do some ministry for a weekend. And so she and my wife had a good long conversation over lunch. And at the end of the conversation, my wife realized that she was dissociated, that her dad, when she was a little girl, had been very physically abusive toward her. And now she didn't know any of that. All those memories were totally blocked. The first inkling that we had anything wrong was when her mother made a comment to me about 20 years ago that she divorced my wife's father, my father-in-law, who's now deceased. That she said she divorced him because she was afraid he was going to kill my wife as a little girl in one of his drunken rages. And, they used to have to escape from the house and go to safe houses, she and the kids, when he came home in a drunken rage. I mean, he was a very professional man, very respectable job. I knew him for a number of years, and he didn't remember having done any of this. In fact, my wife once asked him, and he had no memory of having done it to her because we believe it was his dad did it to him when he was a little boy. He once said, he made the comment to her, my dad was a SOB, a real SOB. I mean, and that's one of the few comments he ever made about his dad. So in any case, she realized that she was dissociated, and so, obviously we started to have some very long conversations between the two of us. And then she since has started receiving ministry. She has had a number of her parts, her altered or identities healed. In fact, just 2 days ago, she and I have gotten to where I can minister to her, which is kind of unusual because normally it's hard to minister to your spouse because and in fact, for the first couple of years, I couldn't minister to her. We had another friend of ours who I was mentoring, so this friend would minister to my wife while I would mentor the friend in the session. The friend would look at me and say, "What do I do now?" And I'd say, "Well, try this." "Oh, okay." And she would try that, and so she would minister to my wife. But then it got to the point where I could minister to her directly, so we didn't need to schedule with her. And about every month or two, a part has come forward that she says, "Okay, I'm really dealing with this part," or something will happen in an interaction with a friend, and she'll just really overreact, and she'll go, "Oh, I dissociated," and we'll talk about, well, how did you really feel when you were in that moment? I felt so horribly rejected. Well, what do you suppose the name of that part was? Rejection.
And that's not a demon.
Now that brings up a related topic.
Because I would have just been like, that's a demon.
Exactly. Because if there is one demon, if you ever do deliverance ministry, if there's any one demon that you could just guarantee is there,
yes,
it's rejection.
Exactly. Yes, I don't think I've met anyone yet.
And if you go back and read Pigs in the Parlor with Frank and Ida Mae Hammond, that'll explain why.
Yeah.
Great book back in the day. So she had the part, and she had a demonic attachment to the part. Now that brings up another topic which we can dive into, demons and parts. But I think while we're here, maybe it might be good to talk about what is it like to be married to someone who's dissociated. Or because I made a comment.
Your spouse might know it before you do.
Know
that there's something wrong.
Exactly. They may not be able to describe what it is or put their finger on it, and it may be crazy making to them, but they know there's something wrong. Because they live with it, they experience it.
Right.
And for me, sometimes she just gets quiet for a while. It's like, well, is everything all right? But so let's say, you can tell when a part is coming forward in your spouse or in a friend, and a lot of us have very close, I would say almost everybody knows somebody who's dissociated. Because if I had to guess as the percentage of the population that's dissociated, I'd probably say 20%.
Mm. How much of that do you think is from satanic ritual abuse?
This is a total swag,
Right.
but I would say ritual abuse maybe less than 5%.
Mm.
So, but
That's still a lot.
still a lot. Oh
Yeah.
yeah. And so, but most of us know people who are dissociated. So I think it's important to be able to know how to get along with someone who's dissociated.
Mm-hmm.
You know, something will come up. She'll have an interaction with another family member that it just devastates her. And so she retreats into that part and may be there for several days.
Mm.
And you can't, if you try to ignore it, it's not going to help. You know, she needs validation. She needs understanding. And so it's almost like this is a different personality that is speaking through your spouse's mouth. Recognize it is for what it is. It's a different personality that has its own thoughts, its own fears, its own pain, and it's far more limited in its capacity than she normally would be. And so it's almost like talking to a small child who is much more limited in capacity, right? I mean, you don't talk to one of your children the way you talk to your wife, right? Mm-hmm. It's much more of a gentle listening carefully to what their small childlike voice is saying and walking them through.
Even explaining very simple things.
Yeah,
to them.
Yeah, exactly. So there's a you have to sort of go back in simplicity a little bit when you work with that part. And I think one of the best things you can do is validate that part. Yes, the pain that you feel is very real. Now, the current scenario is triggering what originally caused that part to split off in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. And you have to ask the question, why did the part come forward? It's because there is something in the current situation that is remotely similar to what caused that part to split off in the first place, right? And so that part is like, oh, when such and such happens, it's my job to come out and deal with it. Oh, this situation feels like it's my job, even though it's 100 times less severe than what dissociated me in the first place.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, this is my turf. So when a part comes forward, it will feel very intensely, whatever it feels. And the intensity that it feels will be all out of proportion to the recent episode that the person went through. And so you just work with them, you walk through them, empathize with them, and then gradually when they feel safe again, then the part can go back and your normal spouse comes out or friend.
Wow. In ministering to a part, you kind of have, you do have to be practiced in discipling people in general, because it is like over and over again. And I know this is true for my wife as I've watched her minister. You have to explain the gospel over and over again
to the
little
different parts.
Children.
Okay. I want to get into that topic. Do we want to first deal with the demon versus a part?
Sure.
And then let's get into that, because that that's part of the healing process of the part, right? Demons versus parts. I have been doing this long enough that I've come to my default place is that I assume that there is at least a demon attached to every part. And so when I want to work with that part, the first thing I need to do is remove the demon. Now, it can be a demon, or it can be much worse. It can be principalities or powers. When you get into ritual abuse, it can be principalities and powers. And, Ephesians 6:10 does not say, for we cast out principalities and powers. It says we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. So if you try to cast out a principality or a power, you are asking for some serious trouble.
So what, in casting out demons, I know there's like Beelzebub and there's Jezebel and there's Behemoth, and I believe Behemoth is one, and all these they're kind of grandiose names.
Yeah, Leviathan,
Baal.
Yeah, Baal, Moloch is another big one. And then the goat head, Baphomet.
Right.
Yeah, all these different. So how do you deal with
what is are those principalities or are those demons?
Those are the highest level principalities. If you liken the enemy's kingdom to an army, those are like the 10-star generals. When you get into Baphomet, Moloch,
When
that
people
level.
say, when they cast out a spirit of Jezebel or Baphomet or whatever, is it like a spirit under one of those?
If you're casting out a demon successfully, yes. Now, if Jezebel many times is beyond the demonic level, and if you want to get yourself into a lot of trouble, try casting out something that is beyond a demon. And a great book on that subject, sorry to interrupt, is a book by John Paul Jackson called Needless Casualties of War. And in that book, he says, look, do not cast out principalities and powers. Now, I can give you a very effective approach, very simple, very effective approach to dealing with principalities and powers. When I'm ministering to a part, and I learned this from my mentor, and may I just quick plug there, her name is Diane Hawkins. Her ministry is Restoration in Christ Ministries. You can go to her website, www.rcm-usa.org. If you go there and go under events, she's got lots of classes, lots of training. Every person who is dissociated, I highly recommend her foundational training, because survivors, among other things, your life is crazy. This is very crazy making. You need to understand what's going on. These classes will very systematically, methodically help you to understand what's going on inside of me, and they will provide you some basic tools that you can use if you've got nobody to minister to you. So I strongly recommend those. But in any case, I learned this from her. So let's say if I'm dealing with a demon who's an attachment, if the person agrees, yes, I can remove it. But anytime there's dissociation, there's probably more going on that's meeting the eye. So this is the approach I recommend. Ask the Most High God to send his angel with the sword of the Spirit to separate or remove or sever, whatever word you like to use, from this part, anything of an evil or ungodly attachment, sent to separate it. Now that will temporarily remove it. Then ask the Most High God, and I use that. God has a lot of names, but this is one of his names that carries the greatest of authority and the enemy cannot emulate. Ask the Most High God to pass judgment against it. Send it to the destination. All that was just removed, send it to the destination of his choosing. Close and seal all portals, all orifices that were used to gain access. Fill the evacuated places with his true Holy Spirit. And finally, ask the Most High God to declare that there shall be no retribution or retaliation for this transaction of any kind. Sounds weird, but try it. That gets me results 98% of the time.
And that's amazingly and frustratingly specific.
But it works.
Yeah,
it works.
It's one of the things, though, about ministering that we, sometimes you say be healed and someone's healed, but a lot of times you have to be a whole lot more specific than that.
Oh, yeah. The man in the tombs, Jesus in one session healed the guy.
Right. And
I would give my eye tooth to know. What does he know that I don't know? And,
right.
We used to measure healing for people, especially ritual abuse survivors. We used to measure their healing in decades. Now we measure it in months and years. And hopefully the day will come when we can do it in one session like Jesus did it. But right now, this is kind of the state of the art.
And is that simply because, this sounds crazy to say, but I think this is, by me saying it, I guess I'm saying this is what I think it must be, but that we are just so far behind, spiritually speaking, as far as like understanding the spiritual realm, that the Satanists have made it literally a science. and we're playing
Oh,
catch up.
yeah. Oh, and unfortunately, we are playing catch up. Yeah. Yeah, the church is way behind in this arena. Most people don't even want to hear about it.
That's actually something worth discussing as well. Is just that what is what does church look like? What does a church that wants to minister to survivors and DID
Yeah.
people with DID? What would a church like that look like?
Yeah. So generally, that sort of thing is not done out in the open. A lot of churches who get into this arena will have emotional healing ministries where they can do the more common type of ministry. I came out of a church in Dallas called Gateway Church. When we were going there, the average weekly attendance was 38,000. And
Wow.
they had a whole department of multiple pastors devoted to emotional healing. And I was on that team for a number of years, and some amazing ministers there. Whenever they ran into DID or SRA, they would hand them off to a professional, but that cost money, like $100 an hour. And these were Christian professionals who were very good at what they did.
And if you've done it, you know why, because it's an enormous time investment.
Oh, yes. Each person that I minister to, that I take on, it's a multi-year commitment.
Right.
Meeting once weekly or biweekly.
Right. That's one of the reasons why I'm sure many people don't get into it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And so now back to the previous thing. So I talked about how to remove the demon or whatever the principality, the power, whatever evil attachment there is from that part. Usually when you've done that, you wait a moment, just let the person gather thoughts. Hey, do you notice any difference? If they do, great. If they don't, okay, fine, we'll move on. And then you start working with the part. Now, parts have trust issues. They were created to deal with someone that, abuses you in life-threatening ways. So they don't trust anybody. So if I'm going to minister to somebody, if I'm going to minister to a part, I need to be able to talk to that part. I need to gain the trust of that part. And so I think the number one quality that you need in this arena is gentleness. Because a lot of these parts are 2-3 years old. They split. That's the age the person was when they split off. Well, how do you treat a 2-year-old child, but with tremendous gentleness, right? And you can't fake gentleness, and so parts will, and so the first part takes the longest, but then when that part starts to get used to you, then the other parts, they're watching. Oh, you were real sweet with this one. Maybe I can trust you as well. So the more you work with somebody, the more they tend to come forward, but you have to be able to talk to the part. And I'd like to get back to a question you asked a while ago about preaching the gospel to them. And I'll tell you how I work with them. My theory is nobody can preach the gospel of Jesus Christ better than Jesus himself. So what I do is I will ask the person or the part, because sometimes I'll talk to the person and I'll ask the person to talk to the part, which leaves them partly in control and things don't get out of hand. But I'll ask them, does this part know who Jesus is? And sometimes they do. And sometimes they don't like him, because where was he when I cried out to him when my daddy was doing XYZ to me day in and day out? So sometimes they don't like him. But what I do is, if they don't know them, I'll say, well, there's someone. A lot of times that part will carry a tremendous amount of pain, like you alluded to earlier. And so before you can reintegrate a part, you need to heal their pain. And so what I'll do is I will work with the part to where the part is willing to have Jesus come be with them. Sometimes they're so afraid of him, I'll say, well, what if he just stands off a good ways off and you can just see him from a distance? Would that be okay? And I asked the part, what would be something that they would feel okay with being around him? Because if they start to sense his presence, I mean, any of us who've ever experienced his presence, there's nothing like it.
Mm-hmm.
And when that part starts to experience his presence, then sometimes I'll say, well, Lord, could you come be with this part? And he's always faithful. He always shows up. And can you be with them? And he knows exactly how far away to stand. He knows sometimes he comes up and he sits and he just sets them in his lap. Other times he talks to them. Other times I'll say to the part, well, why don't you hand your pain to Jesus? And they'll take this big ball of pain and just hand it to him. I mean, you just kind of work with each one and you kind of ask God to give you the questions to ask. And ask Jesus, and you just sort of end up partnering with the Lord, and you develop it's a great working relationship. It's one of my all-time favorite working relationships, that's for sure. That's got to be number one. But gradually, Jesus will heal the part of their pain, and once they're healed, they're generally ready to reintegrate.
And that's the goal.
That's kind of my standard operating procedure.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much more to ask, and I think we'll need to have you come back.
Okay, well, yeah. I know we've already taken up a good amount of time.
Well,
so maybe...
actually, my wife's gonna have a baby in the morning, so I have things I have to do. But I would love to have you on here again. Could you maybe share one of your favorite memories of doing ministry, of how you saw God move in this arena?
Oh gosh, yeah. Let's see. There's many of them, and trying to pick one.
Because you've been doing this for 8 years now.
With ritual abuse survivors, yeah, and about 20 years with dissociation. Oh gosh, let's see. What's a good one? Well, I'll. How about with my wife 2 days ago? That's pretty fresh in my mind. She had this part, and the name of the part was rejection. And I first that prayer that I did, that I mentioned, I did that prayer with her, and then rejection had any evil attachments moved, and I just said, "Honey, can we ask does this part know who the Lord is?" And she said, "Yeah, I think she does, because she's had a number of other ministry sessions, and so this part had seen the other ones." And she went, "Ooh, this part, she's got a lot of pain. Oh." And the more she could connect with this part, I mean, I could just see her realizing. And which made a lot of sense to me, because there are times I could just see her go into a state of great pain. So we just asked, and I just said, "Well, could we invite the Lord to be with her?" And she said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, honey, why don't you invite the Lord?" And she did. She just invited him to come be with this little part. And he just, for a while there, he just talked to her. And I have no idea what he said. I didn't want to interrupt the conversation. It's between him and the part. So I just sit there and I'm quiet. And she knows that when it's a good stopping point, she'll stop and describe to me what just happened. And then and I said, "Well, how about she just give that pain to the Lord?" And she said, "Okay." And she said, "Rejection, would you like to give your pain to the Lord?" And he had by that time already developed the trust with this little part, that she just gave it to him. And then I was like, okay. And then sometimes the Lord likes to go for a walk with them, or dance with them, or whatever, sit in his lap. I don't want to rush him. He's the one in charge. So I waited to see and he sort of spent a little bit of time with her. And then I said, and then she knew, she said, "I think this one is ready to reintegrate." And I said, "Well then, honey, why don't you ask the Lord to reintegrate her?" And she said, "Oh, Lord, would you please reintegrate this rejected part? She's had so much rejection in her life. Would you just please reintegrate her?" And by this time, she and I have done it enough that we just both kind of sat back there. And after about a minute, she went, "Okay, it's done."
Wow.
like, great, next,
And do you notice like physical healing or more joy, or like what is the outcome of that? Because one of the things I have noticed is that a lot of times people get healing and almost like it makes room for the next one to come forward.
Oh, yes, absolutely. Yeah. And there's one lady I minister to on a weekly basis, and after every session pretty much results in a major merger or reintegration. And she'll get about 2 or 3 days of just peace. And then the next part starts to come forward. Yeah. And then the following week, she's, we got to meet again, and we're ready to dive into the next one. So yes, it's a definite journey, but I'm able to enjoy my wife. I mean, we're able to laugh and joke around today a whole lot more than we ever, in ways I just could not have imagined when we first got married. I mean, now we have fun. Whereas she was very serious and quite withdrawn during the early years of our marriage.
Well, the whole topic is a bit overwhelming, but it is extremely relevant to what's going on in our culture. Just in the Satanism is incredibly, horrifyingly popular right now in a lot of ways. It's in high positions of our government, the border. There are thousands and thousands of kids being trafficked and used in this way. And Jesus said, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me to preach good news to the poor, to set the captives free, to bind up the brokenhearted." So if the church doesn't get involved in helping, nobody's going to. And
you mentioned the brokenhearted. That's Luke 4:18, where he's quoting from Isaiah 60, I think. In the Greek, that word broken is shattered.
Right.
It's a shattered heart, and that's dissociation.
Right. Yeah, and in ways, it's kind of amazing to me that Jesus never spoke openly about this directly, or that there's some kind of instruction in the Bible. But I do believe, and this has been the burden of my song for a long time, that God created a world where we have to be intentional about the way we get invested with Him. And it may be that as you've heard this today, and maybe you don't dissociate, but you think, oh, I can't afford to get involved in something like that. It is overwhelming in the sense that when you think about the time, but so is everything in life. Having a child, my wife's supposed to have a child tomorrow. That's overwhelming. I mean, that's overwhelming for her, but yet Jesus says, go through it. Even in the valley of the shadow of death, He is with us. And there is a piece of Him that we cannot know except by working with Him in that way. And I'm sure you know Jesus better, and you're more like Jesus for having invested in the ministry.
Oh my gosh, no comparison.
Yeah,
no comparison.
Yeah, it's that word compassion. Compassion is co-suffering, and so you learn to have compassion or gentleness by learning to share other people's suffering. And you also get to share their joys.
Amen.